Okay, so we're exactly on time. I wanted to welcome everybody to Global Skills Day and this panel on effective entrepreneurial ecosystems. My name is Emily Egan. I am the Director of Strategic Initiatives at the Albert Lepage Center for Entrepreneurship and Innovation at Tulane University in New Orleans, Louisiana. And I'm so excited to be here with you today to talk about entrepreneurship ecosystems, as I've been able to see firsthand how important they are to a community, both from an economic standpoint, but also from a revitalization standpoint. And I think, based off sort of where we all are today, revitalization is something that we're all having and, is very top of our minds. So before we get started on the panel and I have the panelists introduce themselves, I do want to just give a couple of housekeeping notes. First and foremost, the Q&A and the chat are open. So please feel free to use those as we go throughout the session. I'm going to be doing our best to keep us on time. And so the hope will be that at the end, we will be able to address some of those audience Q&As, but it'll be entirely based off of how much time we have left. And we have a lot to cover in a short amount of time. So with that being said, I did want to first give an opportunity for our great panelists to introduce themselves. So if each of you, and I'll go through so it's not a free for all at once, could just introduce yourself, your name, your organization, and just give a brief overview of the organization that you're representing and how that relates to ecosystem development. So I will start with Vinny.
Hi there, my name is Vinicius Lages, Vini, and I'm now in Northeast Brazil, in the beautiful state of Alagoas. I am the director of Sebrae. Sebrae is a small business development agency, like you have in the US, the SBDC, SBDA network. So we work nationwide with over 7,000 experts, consultants, to support small business and foster entrepreneurship in a nation. In a nation scale. We're not, we do not belong to the government, but though we are public funded. So it's quite an interesting institution. So we have to join the panel.
Thank you so much. Nicola.
Hi, lovely to be here. I am Nicola. I am the daughter of an entrepreneur myself, then turned venture capitalist, and now have the pleasure of being the founding CEO of the Nasdaq Entrepreneurial Center. We are a nonprofit focused on the intersection of access and equity in the field of entrepreneurship worldwide. We're 6 years old, so still a bit of a startup of startups ourselves. But in the last 5 years, we've really been privileged to work beside more than 44,000 entrepreneurs from 120 countries, 50% female and 70% minority at large, every industry, every stage. And we're really trying to lift up and learn from all of these great global innovation economies so that we can transcend both resiliency and opportunity, not just for entrepreneurs because it's a nice to have, but because we really believe it is an imperative in these days and age.
Thank you so much. Stephan.
Apologies, talking whilst on mute. Hi, Stephan. Great pleasure to be with all of you today for this super exciting topic. I'm a partner in Startup Genome. Startup Genome started life 10 years ago, founded by a number of serial entrepreneurs in Silicon Valley who asked themselves the question, why do we have this wealth concentration that startup ecosystems create in Silicon Valley, maybe in New York, maybe in London and a few other places, but why does it not really spread across the globe into many more clusters? And what can we do as an organization to codify a little bit the insight? What makes a great ecosystem? What's the DNA of a startup ecosystem, which we've done over the last 10 years. We built mathematical models that help explain what works, what doesn't work. And we use these mathematical models to have a very objective and very open debate, particularly with policymakers, be they public, be they leaders in private initiatives, to help them ascertain what really works. What works at a certain point in your development as an ecosystem? What should you rather not be doing or wait till you actually execute a certain initiative? When does it really make sense to be efficient? As having said, with the overall aim, that's what we stand for, get the knowledge of ecosystem development into as many places in the world. It should not matter where you live in order to become an entrepreneur and to be successful. Thank you.
Thank you. And Gloria.
Hello from Puerto Rico, on our way to become an enterprising island. My name is Gloria Viscasillas. I lead economic development programs at Banco Popular de Puerto Rico and serve since 2012 as the lead integrator of the multi-sector alliance Echar that means to move forward in Spanish. Our mission is to accelerate the development of an entrepreneurship, innovation, resilience, and sustainability culture as a means to restore growth and prosperity for all in the island. We have over 500 institutional allies and over 6,000 volunteers. We're glad to contribute to identify potential solutions to our common global challenges. Nice to be here.
Thank you so much. So we're going to jump right in with some questions. As I've mentioned this to the panelists, but I'll just also remind everybody that we want this to be a conversation. So some of the questions will be directed specifically to the panelists. Other ones will be directed more to just the entire group of panelists. And at any point in time, feel free to the panelists to sort of add your take and your expertise wherever you feel it appropriate. So okay, so to kick things off, let's start with some just foundation setting questions. So for beginning, to everybody on the panel, why are ecosystems important both to entrepreneurs and communities?
Well, I'm happy to sort of start the conversation off, and primarily because I think we see how much is dependent on the rise of all innovation economies, not just one. You know, we're based in Silicon Valley, and our entrepreneurs are global from day one. Whether it is securing talent, whether it is identifying funding, whether it is, you know, sourcing customers, supply chain, whatever the issues are, there is no such thing as a localized entrepreneur that doesn't have a need to participate in a global innovation economy. And so the rise of all is what it takes to really be successful. Now, unfortunately, or fortunately, there's a little bit of the land of Oz that has happened in Silicon Valley for 50 plus years, where the concentration has predominantly been around capital access here. That is, I think, you know, an interesting concept that we can come back to look at is like, what about COVID and how has that distribution changed in the last year plus? But at least for a while now, we felt a pressure to really learn and connect from others. And we haven't done as much sort of outbound engagement as we really need to. And so where we're now seeing new disruption coming forward and new economies taking off, our entrepreneurs are desperately trying to learn from those and connect with those more intentionally. So for us, I think, you know, the importance and the criticality around a global innovation economy and the rise of all communities starts with understanding the needs and the challenges of our entrepreneurs. And they are not isolated. They cannot be isolated, because when one is isolated, they are limited in their ability to sort of source and thrive from the best and find their solutions that matter to them.
Nicola, maybe let me jump right in. And being Genome, you would expect some data, some numbers, right?
Of course.
So when I think about community, we're probably the only people who try to measure the quality of a community. So as a startup entrepreneur, as Nicola puts it, if I'm on my own, no access to resource, no bouncing off of ideas. We did some measurements around the world, call it local connectedness. If you are living in a community, a real entrepreneurial community, where entrepreneurs to entrepreneur, they help each other, they give themselves time and giving back to community. They can access a business angel and have a conversation, even without a commercial relationship. They can go to a large corporate and ask for some regulatory, for some technical advice for free. That makes a great community. And if an entrepreneur starts in such a great community, the revenues grow 2.5 times as fast. Same talent, same idea, same resource. It's just a question of community. So put a hard number against a fluffy concept that you really can't grasp. I find it incredible. The same goes for global community. Are you embedded in a global community? Do you access these? Do you have access to ideas? You'll grow more than 2.5x as opposed to being in a place which doesn't try to connect to the global community. So both concepts. Why is community important? Because it makes you grow so much faster. It gives you the right ideas and access to resources.
Stephan, that's a really great point that you bring up in terms of both. I think sometimes people think about their ecosystem as a hyper-local, very localized entity, which is in fact the case, but that global ecosystem and that global network, and we'll touch on this a little bit later, of what the pandemic has done to reduce those boundaries and those barriers, and how being a part of that global ecosystem is also just as important as having that community local.
I must say, we were terribly worried when COVID started.
I would like
Oh, sorry, Gloria, just very quickly. We were terribly worried when COVID started. We thought
go
a
ahead.
local community is so much built around the coffee machine, water cooler conversation. But surprisingly enough, looking into the data now, people have adopted so quickly to new ways of communicating. We have not lost that much of this spirit of community and the huge effect that it has, thankfully enough. Possibly it has even opened up many more opportunities, but Emily will come back to those a little bit later.
Absolutely.
Apologies, Gloria. Sorry for barging in.
Oh, don't worry. I would like just to add that given the World Economic Forum projection that by 2027, over 50% of the global workforce will depend on entrepreneurship, and that proportion is going to continue to grow, we need entrepreneurs as a critical economic development contributors and to have sustainable communities.
Thank you.
Well, my take on this, Emily, is that since we borrowed this concept from the biology science, it is important to understand what it is, because it's an ecosystem is diverse and social by design, and it should be as this. There is often a question, the same for entrepreneurship, if it is born or built, and you actually don't know what part of it is built or what part of it is born, but for sure a good ecosystem is important because you can leverage the assets and create more positive externalities in a given territory. And when you do that, when you have a high density of agents, economic agents, social agents, then it's easier to learn. It's easier to change your mindset when you have a culture of entrepreneurship. So an entrepreneurial ecosystem helps people to engage in more entrepreneurial ideas and more entrepreneurial endeavors. It's easier to also to get institutional support. So this whole concept of density and scope, it's why ecosystem became such an important thing. Though throughout history, when we look at the economic development, we see that agglomeration clusters, not only recently, but in the past, in Athens, in Lisbon, in Venice, or during the Renaissance, whenever you had a lot of people getting together, to challenge the status quo, something happened, and that's why I think ecosystem somehow replicates all these dimensions that we have also observed in the past. Because innovation is not something that is new, right? It's not only because we can reach the moon or recode the DNA. It's something that has been going on for centuries.
That's a great kind of segue into the next question for the group, which is, what are those key elements to a startup ecosystem? At the base level, what are those ingredients, or what are those elements that need to exist for it to be successful? And I would say that this would be primarily more, as you're talking about, more of a local ecosystem versus a larger global ecosystem.
If you allow me to kick off on this, and I would say that an enabling environment, it's for sure when you have an enabling environment and a culture that helps entrepreneurship, it's easier for sure. Anybody that studies different ecosystems around the world can see that if you have a difficult regulatory system, it is harder to start a business. If you don't have regulatory sandbox or incentives, it's harder. Or where you don't have a culture of innovation, it's harder. So those 2 points for me are key elements, besides infrastructure, technology, or financial institution, whatever. But those two are key for me.
Building on Vinicius' previous comments, I would say that the first and main element all ecosystems need is a knowledgeable human capital, committed and preferably well integrated into a collaboration community of key stakeholders with a common mission, even if they are working in parallel or in silos. If the key stakeholders share a broad knowledge of the best practices for effective ecosystems and are well connected, both formally and informally, as a group, they can establish the components needed to stimulate entrepreneurship in an exponential fashion.
There's I'm sorry, go ahead.
You go ahead, Nicola.
I was just going to say, there's always been this interesting question that is poised around Silicon Valley. I'm sure everyone here has heard it, and that is like, what makes it so special? And you know, is it the fear of failure? Is it the acceptance of failure, the tolerance of risk? All of these types of dream big ideas. And I think, you know, being part of Startup America and some other initiatives, one element that we kept coming back to as the common denominator was a pay it forward approach here. And so now really what I am curious about is seeing in these emerging innovation economies that same spirit of paying it forward, that same recognition of, let me take an hour to meet with you about an idea that you have for improving yourself, your business, this community, some construct, even though there isn't a direct with them, right? There isn't a direct what's in it for me. There is no through line. I'm going to get a business deal out of it. I'm going to get, you know, this pat on the back, this bravado, this media lift, whatever the case is. It's, I believe in you and I want to support you and your ideas. And I'm innately curious around how do we build up more problem solvers around our community. And if you can scale up that impact, that pay it forward approach, I think that is the most critical foundational element to making sure it's sustainable over time. Because otherwise what we see time and time again is like these voluminous scenarios where there's a moment of time, a catapulting experience for a territory, for a location, and then 5 years, 10 years, 15 years later, it's knocked away. And you wonder why. And if it isn't sort of a movement by the people, with the people, and with everyone feeling a critical part of that success, that's, I think, the danger zone to watch for in like sustainable economies of scale here at an innovation layer.
Emily, if I may comment, it's one of the most striking elements, what I mentioned from my lessons from Silicon Valley in the past few years. I've been 3 times. Silicon Valley, and one thing that strikes me is how people are open to share the doubts, the problems, even the codes. Sometimes, you know, it's amazing. It's part of the trust system that Nicola was talking about. It's really something that should exist so that people can learn together and move faster, right?
Nicola and Vinicius, I mean, we work amongst so many aspiring ecosystems, sometimes really early activation phase. There's not much. Challenged economies, and you see all of a sudden a very competitive and non-sharing culture. People who go to party, they're best friends in private life, but they're not sharing ideas entrepreneur to entrepreneur. And so all this, I got something, it might be worth something. I'm in a economically challenged environment. I'm really scared somebody will run off with my idea, and it really limits their ability to develop. Yeah, something we really need to overcome. I'm so glad you mentioned these as so important parts of building a community. We really need to drive this culture in many more places. That's for sure. Maybe last point that's more structural. I think we see the best success, particularly in smaller ecosystems. If we are successful in getting all these different stakeholders behind a common mission. So you're a corporate executive, you're a large-scale institutional investor, you're a university dean. Can you support? Are you really not just by saying I find this an interesting initiative, but really committing to it, really putting time into it, supporting an ecosystem and the build-up of an ecosystem. So the academic field, the investor field, the entrepreneurs themselves to articulate themselves properly, government regulators to take a keen eye and a helping hand to it. There's a role for them. And last but not least, also traditional corporations to really engage. It's all to be won, but it's many barriers and cultural barriers in many places. So we got our work carved out, all of us.
Well, it's true, and Gloria has fantastic experience as it relates to bringing all of those groups together. And I would love for Gloria to sort of talk briefly about, and not necessarily briefly, but to give it sort of an overview that Puerto Rico has built a globally recognized framework for their entrepreneurship ecosystem. And, it was, and I don't want to put words in Gloria's mouth, but it was almost out of, an event or a need to develop this framework, similar to sort of what we had to do in New Orleans after Katrina. But I think the infrastructure that Gloria and Puerto Rico have built is something that I think could be replicated, and would love, Gloria, for you to take a couple of minutes to to talk about sort of the core elements that you've put into place within your ecosystem, and how you decided, or how you got to the point where you realized these were the necessary pieces.
Thanks, Emily. First of all, we designed a framework to enable knowledge-based change based on 3 strategies: build the movement, build capacity, and build the systems. So we purposefully went through this ecosystem building project. To this end, we conducted a mapping of the Puerto Rico elements that were available at the so-called ecosystem, and surveyed our stakeholder needs every 2 years since 2010. In 2010, what we found is that what we had just was a few elements and a very fragile, disconnected ecosystem. The main needs identified for all stakeholders were education in entrepreneurship and innovation, and a well-trained and easily available, accessible support practitioners network, especially mentors and coaches to accompany entrepreneurs in their journey. We had many well-meaning folks volunteering to serve as mentors, but just a few that had been trained. We then started a knowledge building program to identify world-leading practices in entrepreneurship development, and conducted periodic yet continuous knowledge sharing forums that serve to integrate the leaders of our 5 largest sectors: the academia, the private and public sectors, nonprofits, and solidarity movements that represent grassroots initiatives and our unions. To quickly develop that critical mass of educators and support practitioners needed, the International Council for Small Business local chapter helped us to develop a series of basic certifications, and we partnered with the 7 largest universities, the Department of Education, and the main entrepreneur support service organizations to foster participation. The knowledge transference forums and stakeholder certifications served as team building efforts, better called community building efforts, to bring everybody to the same page. And in the area of systems building, our strategy was to engage trainers and trainees to identify potential system components, design through co-creation the systems we wanted, pilot with real communities, and impact and establish impact measurement of the best ideas. The results facilitated the selection of components that became part of collectively engineered roadmaps to develop those systems that we wanted to stimulate entrepreneurship at the school level, the college level, and the community level. But the whole program is an integrated program with the collaboration of all the leaders and key liaisons of each of the 5 sectors.
Great. And that's something that I think it kind of leads into the next question, which is, from an ecosystem development standpoint, and Stephan, you touched on this as well, and this idea that there's a lot of stakeholders that have a role in that ecosystem, and bringing that group together and aligning them behind that common goal can be really challenging, especially when everyone's going to have their own specific interests in mind and what they think that it should be. And so I'm curious to know from the group, what effective strategies, and I think Gloria, you outlined it really well as with your previous answer, but what other sort of effective strategies have you all seen that help sort of bring that community together, to bring the governments, the universities, the entrepreneurship support organizations, the entrepreneurs, all of those vested parties, to bring them to the table and get them aligned behind this, and then maintain, the most important part is maintaining that commitment over the course of time, as the ecosystem develops itself and changes.
Maybe Emily, let me give it a very brief try. So just observational.
Well, I may jump in and just complete the exposition.
Sure. So, yeah, Gloria, if you could just briefly finish your thought, and then we'll go over to Stephan, if that's okay with Stephan.
Gloria, please.
Sure. I just want to share that it's been a journey. Even though all ideas and elements have some benefits, not everything has significant impact, and we have had to pivot and drop some elements because they really didn't work. But three things that I would say that have been effective are massive training of leaders, educators, and support practitioners together. By training them together, then they develop a same common knowledge. Also, the rigorous discipline knowledge sharing with everybody based on 360 communications and continuous communication, so that we have all the key stakeholders in the same page.
Thank you. Okay, Stephan.
Yeah, and Gloria on the same notion. So I think what we've seen quite a bit is top down. Government, municipality government, whatever it is, decides we want to have an innovation ecosystem, and it all becomes a top-down exercise. Seen a lot, has been tried. We've never seen it to work in a great way. It really doesn't resonate. It's certainly the wrong approach. Sometimes results in what we would call innovation theater. So you got your startup prize and your competition and nice photographs and policymakers shaking hands with entrepreneurs, and that's the result of it. That's not what we want. Bottom up is the other extreme. Bottom up and grassroots, great, lots of ideas, lots of dynamic. What we frequently see, though, are some missing elements. So involvement of government from a funding perspective, from a legislation, a regulatory perspective, not so great, because there are some elements missing in very young grassroots community movements. So the question for us is, can we find a way to bridge these? Can we build a hybrid model that brings more experienced people in, but still leaves the energy of the grassroots movement? And I think one of the nicest examples, most effective examples we've seen, been devised by former colleagues. One is actually Vinicius in your part of the world, Lais de Oliveira. The concept of Keystone, also tried in Amsterdam in the Netherlands. Entrepreneurial-minded people with experience, serial entrepreneurs, who commit a year of their time to work across the community, connect, to backfill gaps that exist in support mechanisms, be it funding, be it talent education, whatever it is, but then hand over. They don't try to own an ecosystem. It's not like a government which tries to own it and put it into a structure. They take responsibility, but they hand it off to other people at some point and move towards the next gap, the next challenge. Sounds a bit fluffy, but I can only encourage all of you here in listening to the panel, have a look. Startup Amsterdam, Ruben, Keystone team, or Lais de Oliveira has published a book on community development. They're fantastic insights and they really work. And I think that makes a difference. So the hybrid, maybe the best of both worlds, seems to work the most effective.
I love that. I really do. And I think only to amplify a little bit is realizing that a lot of the time, it has been our experience that the KPIs that drive recognition of, are we doing it well? Are we doing it okay? Are we doing it poorly? Are really isolating in nature. And so to really take the time to have a comprehensive analysis of what is a healthy entrepreneurial ecosystem, measuring beyond dollars and cents, measuring beyond number of jobs created, is critical for everyone to find themselves in a role where they are contributing to the overarching success. So when we only count up number of jobs or number of dollars or increases of revenues or patents or even venture dollars flowing, it's just a little tip of that quintessential iceberg that's popping out over the water, right? There is so much more that lives below it. Agency, of individuals to say, I have a career pathway forevermore that is defined because I have the PACE attributes that are present from being an entrepreneurial thinker in the world. I'm a problem solver. I'm adaptable to any industry disruption. I'm creative. I am an entrepreneurial empowered individual. That's hard to measure. People have been doing it forever. I think Stephan and Startup Genome have done a much better job in many ways of sort of saying, what is a holistic approach to measuring entrepreneurship in its full entirety? But it's so easy to go to the numbers and then so hard to realize that it becomes a have and have not scenario. The players that are required to be successful at investing in it don't find themselves as part of the solution to be invested in it. So really codifying a new approach and a new strategy around how do we know that we're doing it successfully and what are our markers to really recognize that, I think has been, when we look at sustainability of an ecosystem, the common denominator that's present.
That sets up perfectly the question that I have for Stephan, which is about measurement of effectiveness, right? It is about, what are those metrics you should be looking at? I can speak from our experience here in New Orleans, and in other emerging ecosystems, we have a tendency to compare ourselves to the Silicon Valleys, the New Yorks, the Londons of the world. And in my opinion, I don't necessarily see that as the appropriate benchmark, as the appropriate measure. So I was curious from Stephan's perspective, especially looking at sort of multiple, sort of the global ecosystems outside of those financial centers, outside of those sort of really high volume areas, for a smaller ecosystem, what are those, or even just a new ecosystem, what are those measures that you see that really do equate to effectiveness and sustainability?
Yeah. Emily, first of all, maybe the notion of peer comparison of ecosystems. We are operating a network of about 100 cities, 40 countries. For policy leaders, ecosystem leaders, keystone teams to exchange ideas. And the most we learn, actually, it's a learning network, a living learning network. The most we learn is when we close the doors to the outside world and say, guys and girls, what has actually not worked? What have you tried in terms of certain policies? And we open up amongst each other and can say, don't do that in funding policy. We tried it 5 years ago in Australia or somewhere in Europe, and it really didn't work. It had adverse effects. Let's learn from that. So that's the power of peer learning. And peer comparison, obviously, then is, can I compare myself to somebody and can I learn from that experience? Personally, I'm sitting here in London. I've had visiting delegations from governments all around the world every week saying, what did you do 10 years ago? What was so amazing? Why did London develop so fast? And I think in Silicon Valley, it will be very, very, very similar. Everybody coming to see Silicon Valley and say, oh, we've been Silicon Valley, we know it all. How does that help if I'm sitting in a tier 2 city in Germany, in Serbia, in Taiwan? What can I replicate? Very often we saw that people after these study trips going back to their ecosystems, having seen very shiny things, 100 things, and saying, let's implement them all. Let's do it in year 1 because it's great. Silicon Valley has done it. Never works. There's no focus. It's the wrong measure at the wrong time. So we went with an ecosystem lifecycle model, and whatever you do, it doesn't have to be the same model, but I think the idea is good to say where an ecosystem develops as a life cycle. It gets born, it grows, it kind of consolidates, and then really it integrates with the world. For us, it's 4 phases. Where am I sitting in these phases and what's required in a certain phase? If I'm really young, for us, small ecosystem somewhere in the world, try to grow organically. Don't talk about venture funding and Series B and scale-ups. It's the wrong discussion. You don't have any chance to work in that field. Concentrate on getting more startups. It's a number of size in the end. Go from 10 to 100 startups. You will have a little bit more success. Go from 100 to 800, and all of a sudden you will see really exponential effects in growth. That's what you should be doing, and maybe fix some early stage funding gaps. If you're on the other side of the spectrum, very different strategies. So what I'm trying to say is be aware of your situation, find the right comparable peers, maybe 2, 3, 4 years ahead, and try to see what they have been doing. Use their measures, their KPIs to see where your own factor gaps are. I think this really works. In our experience, that really works. It's a meaningful discussion. And luckily enough, today, often the answer of clients, partners in the knowledge network, they would say, yeah, thank you very much. For once, we are not comparing ourselves against Silicon Valley because it does not make sense for us. It really doesn't fit, although it's the shiny thing we all look up to. I think that's the really important mission. Really look at where are you in your stage, be realistic about it. There's a set of strategies that work really well. They don't need reinventing. Stick with them for 2-3 years. And as the ecosystem graduate, be aware you need to change. You need to change horses again. You can't bet on the same strategy, the same team forever for an ecosystem. Every 2-3 years as you grow, there will be a fundamental change. And be aware of that and mindful.
Perfect.
I would like to share as one of our main advisors, Dr. Rafael Braz, former provost of Georgia Tech, once told us that we needed to find our own model, the one that leverages the resources we have or could tap on, and the model that works for us and that rings true to our people. We can definitely learn from the experience, both successes and failures of others, but each region has to find its own recipe because all communities have similar types of assets, but they all have their own flavors and circumstances. In our case, we are measuring ourselves against specific performance goals related to people and systems development, as well as social and economic impact. We are first measuring the human resources impact, such as the number of college professors and school teachers trained, the number of support practitioners that have been certified, the percentage of high schools and college campuses that are implementing a systemic agenda to become enterprising communities. And we went even farther. In the case of the school system, we were measuring impact, and so after we tried to move our schools to become enterprising communities, we saw improvements in GPAs, we saw improvements in the measurement of standardized tests, we saw improvements in the environment in schools, in the number of violence incidents went down, and the attendance of kids to schools went up. Those are specific human resources impacts that ring true to our people and make people be interested in being engaged and supporting the program. We are also monitoring community impact through indicators such as increasing the number of new and established companies, as well as companies that are starting to export. That number was very low, and we have been sharing incentives so that can go up. And in the next few months, we're starting to track the number of companies that report having resiliency and continuity plans, and are starting to track growth in jobs created and revenue of companies by stage of development, especially right now, not the initial ones, but the ones that have been established for a while. So looking at the system from different dimensions, depending on who were the key stakeholders and what, again, rings true to the different constituents.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Nicola, I was curious from your experience, you look at for communities that are looking to either strengthen or to catalyze their startup ecosystem or entrepreneurial ecosystem, how important is it that they look at what their local assets, what their local strengths are? And would love if you have just a brief example that you could share.
Yeah, and I feel like I'm not going to do justice because Stephan and Gloria already did such a beautiful job of highlighting this. In entrepreneurship, we call it founder market fit. If you can identify your founder market fit, game over, right? Like, you're there forever. You know your strengths. You know how you're going to be able to build up that muscle mass that's needed to sustain the long and lonely journey of an entrepreneur. Not different really from the entrepreneurial ecosystems that we're talking about here. One of my favorite examples is actually Lithuania. When they first realized the challenge of looking at a lot of their talent that was leaving and going outbound, whether it was to secure education opportunities or to build their own startups, they really saw the criticality of not having an innovation mindset and ecology inside of themselves. So they started to say, well, what are the ingredients? We don't have giant Sand Hill Road here. We don't even have the large companies to attract and say, well, look, we're going to have the customer base that's here. What do we have? And one of the most amazing moments that they came to was realizing that they had the ability to create a financial sandbox that could actually attract remarkable fintech startups to their environment. If back to that regulatory conversation that has come up throughout a thread here, they said, look, we're going to let you come build and make us better. That transition of a mindset took them from being one that had talent depart from them on a moment-by-moment basis to one that had inbound European, US talent that was hungry to be able to access Lithuania's environment, because that is worth more than the dollars and cents alone can ever do. And I think inside all of the ecologies out there in the world, we can find our own sandbox. And I don't mean like quite literally a sandbox, but we can find our own unique opportunities that will really allow us to leverage our equivalent of a founder market fit. So that's one that comes to mind that I'd share out for now.
I appreciate that. I love that example when you shared that with me the other day. It's a great example of focusing on that sort of your local strengths. Vinny, I was curious, when you and I chatted, we talked about, and I would love for you to share with the rest of the attendees, obviously the pandemic has had a big impact on entrepreneurship. And I think that there's a lot of negatives, but there have been positives. And I would love to know from your perspective, what you've seen in Brazil as it relates to actually new businesses being created out of the pandemic, and how you see that changing the landscape that you had prior.
Thanks, Emily. So in Brazil, it's a country of paradox, because this is one of the largest economies in the world, but we still have a high proportion of poor people, and it's a very unequal country. So from one side, the different lockdowns has hit differently segments of the society. We have at the bottom of the socioeconomic pyramid, we have the micro entrepreneurs that have tried to create their own way of earning their survival to better use whatever resources they had, because the economy was locked down. So it's interesting to see even the micro entrepreneur, the informal sector, doing their digital transformation process, or somehow digitizing some of their activities. So they're trying to use cell phones to open the business, using social media, and have some more attention to, for instance, custom experience that they didn't have before. So it's very interesting to see many micro entrepreneurs entering this new digital economy, from one side, from the bottom of the social economic pyramid, or from the other side, because we have a very dynamic agro business sector. So you've seen a large number of new agri-techs, food techs, new food services, using new business models. A lot of new wellness and fitness business. Some food companies creating new nutritional products to boost your immune system, etc. The health sector also has seen a lot of development of telemedicine. A lot of clinics are now using half of their, serving half of the clients through the web, because they don't need to come to the clinics anymore. So they are getting used, the patients are getting used to this new way of the hybrid medicine. Also, schools have learned to use the learning management systems, and they are using digital platforms. E-commerce has risen 41% last year, to up to $60 billion was dealt through e-commerce last year. So it was a great also impulse. Fintechs, proximity shops, many proximity shops, services or personal service, and many businesses started their internationalization strategy during the pandemic, either because they need to get some supplier from other countries because they didn't find anymore in the region, or even in Brazil. So it's interesting to see all those processes going together. And of course, all of those business models, the new ones and those that are trying to succeed after the pandemic, establish their own digital transformation strategy, taking really into consideration the protocols and then how to be prepared. They come to our office every day. When's going to be the next pandemic? Is there going to be another black swan? And how to prepare for it?
No, I think that that's a great point. And we unfortunately only have 5 minutes left, so I have to skip over some of my pandemic related questions. But I think the pandemic has provided an opportunity for the purposes of accessing mentors on a really wide scale, and so hopefully that continues. But I do want to leave with the final question, and again, we only have 5 minutes, so if you can keep your answers brief. But Vinny, you just touched on it in terms of that, like how do you manage through that resiliency, right? Ecosystem development and an ecosystem itself is a ever-changing, ever-growing organism. Right? It will not stay the same, and things will affect that, whether it's a pandemic, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's an economic downturn. So what is one thing from the panel to close this out? What is one thing from your expertise, your experience, that you would advise an ecosystem on in terms of how to manage that, how to build that sustainable ecosystem that can weather those unexpected events? Vinny, you're on mute.
Sorry, Stephan has talked about how it's important to get stakeholders together behind a common mission. And I think it's even more important to get everyone in an ecosystem to train for resilience. And that is a mindset shift. So you have to be prepared for what is coming, developing future literacy, for instance, knowing that the world is no longer linear or certain or slow, and it's basically a cultural change. Of course, you can get technology, you can build a bunker or to prepare for the Fourth World War or whatever. But the most important thing, I think, is training for resilience. And it's an exercise, and it can be done together if you align all the stakeholders in that same direction.
Great. So with only 3 minutes left, I'm going to ask, instead of the rest of the panel answering it, if we want to have one more of you give your insights. I apologize, but want to make sure we end this on time. So I'll let you all fight it out. But or who wants to be the final word on this?
I don't know. I'll just offer a quick 30-second approach. An innovation economy is built on entrepreneurs who are people, and not dissimilar to what Vinny just shared. They're people, and I think the pandemic and other times show that the loneliness and the hardship and the wellness factor of our entrepreneurs has to be at the forefront of every decision that we make. And we can't leave anyone behind in that process. So never lose sight of who the real stakeholders are, and make sure that we're really leaning in to support them from a wellness perspective above all else, because that's where resilience is born, at the individual layer.
That is perfect. Well, we are just at time. And so I want to just thank everybody so much for their time on this panel. I hope the attendees really enjoyed it. I apologize. We do have one question, but we're out of time, so unfortunately can't answer it. But I hope everybody enjoys the rest of Global Skills Day, and thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you so much. Thanks, panel.
Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you.